In January of 1912, inside the frozen darkness of Antarctica, British explorer Robert Falcon Scott wrote one of the final entries of his life. His team had already reached the South Pole, only to discover that another expedition had beaten them there weeks earlier. The mission that had consumed years of preparation, sacrifice, and obsession was already lost. But the real tragedy was not failure. It was what came after. The temperature kept falling. Supplies were disappearing. Bodies weakened. Every movement became negotiation against exhaustion. Every morning demanded the same impossible decision. Stand up, or remain inside the sleeping bag and let the cold slowly erase the body. Scott and his men were no longer fighting for victory, or recognition, or history. They were fighting something far less visible. The urge to stop. Not because stopping was rational. Not because quitting was strategic. But because every nerve in the body eventually begins to whisper the same seductive message. Enough. Scott continued writing as conditions deteriorated. His final journal entries were calm, almost disturbingly so. No grand speeches. No heroic declarations. Just a mind documenting its own encounter with limits. What is most unsettling is not that these men died in the ice. It is that long before the body collapses, something else begins to collapse first. A hidden threshold inside the mind. A point where discomfort starts rewriting logic itself. Most people imagine surrender as a dramatic event. A loud decision. A visible breaking point. But surrender rarely looks like that. It usually begins much earlier, silently, invisibly, disguised as a perfectly reasonable thought. Just one thought. Why continue? This question does not belong only to explorers lost in polar storms. It appears in bedrooms before dawn, when the alarm rings and the body negotiates with comfort. It appears in gyms when the muscles burn and repetition loses meaning. It appears in front of unfinished work, unread books, difficult conversations, abandoned ambitions, and promises made to oneself in moments of clarity. The modern battlefield is rarely dramatic. There are no glaciers, no collapsing expeditions, no life-or-death landscapes. And yet, the mechanism is the same. A person sits in front of a task they once cared deeply about. 5 minutes pass, then 10. The mind becomes restless. Attention drifts. Motivation evaporates with disturbing speed. Suddenly, the discomfort is no longer physical but psychological. Boredom, irritation, doubt, resistance. And almost automatically, the brain proposes escape. Check the phone. Start tomorrow. Take a break. Do something easier. Most people spend years searching for the wrong solution. They search for better routines, better systems, better productivity methods, better inspiration. They believe the missing ingredient is intensity. More passion, more certainty, more excitement. But excitement is chemically expensive. It fades quickly. No one can live permanently inside emotional momentum. Eventually, every meaningful pursuit becomes ordinary. The new habit becomes repetitive. The ambitious project becomes tedious. The relationship enters friction. The learning curve turns humiliating. And this is the moment almost nobody prepares for. Not the beginning, when everything is energized by novelty, but the middle, the gray zone where progress becomes invisible and effort stops feeling rewarding. This is where identities are decided, not in moments of motivation, but in encounters with emotional flatness. When nothing feels urgent, nothing feels exciting, nothing feels inspiring, and still a person remains. There is a hidden skill operating here, one rarely discussed because it lacks glamour. It cannot be posted, measured, or romanticized. It is the ability to remain psychologically present while the mind begs for relief. To continue one page longer, one repetition longer, one conversation longer, one uncomfortable minute longer. This capacity appears small from the outside. But under the surface, it is reorganizing something fundamental, your relationship with discomfort itself. And once that relationship changes, behavior changes with it. Not because life becomes easier, but because discomfort loses authority. In the early 1970s, Inside a quiet room at Stanford University, psychologists began running an experiment that looked almost absurdly simple. A child was brought into a small room. There were no toys, no distractions, no entertainment. Just a table, a chair, and on the table a reward. Sometimes it was a marshmallow, sometimes a cookie or pretzel. The child was given a choice. Waiting sounds harmless until you observe what waiting actually does to the mind. The body may remain still, but internally, a conflict begins. Attention narrows. Desire intensifies. Time distorts. Seconds feel longer than they are. A treat sitting motionless on a table starts occupying disproportionate psychological space. The longer the child waits, the louder the object seems to become. This is one of the strange properties of denied gratification. Resistance often amplifies the very thing being resisted. The children who succeeded were not necessarily calmer or more mature. What distinguished them was often behavioral strategy. Walter Mischel later observed that children who managed to wait tended to do something psychologically sophisticated. They redirected attention. They looked away from the reward. They covered it. They imagined it differently. Some treated the marshmallow like an abstract object instead of food. Not temptation eliminated. Temptation cognitively restructured. This distinction matters, because people often believe self-control means suppressing desire directly. Attack the craving. Fight the urge. Outmuscle the impulse. But direct suppression is mentally expensive and often unstable. The more attention remains attached to the source of temptation, the more psychologically dominant it becomes. Control is not always about brute force. Sometimes it is architecture, altering what occupies awareness, changing the meaning of the object, reshaping the environment between stimulus and reaction. A child alone in a room was accidentally demonstrating something adults repeatedly fail to understand. Impulse does not need to be destroyed. It only needs enough distance to lose command. And that distance is often measured not in miles or hours, but in attention itself. Years later, the experiment became culturally famous for a reason much larger than candy. Follow-up studies suggested that children who delayed gratification tended, on average, to show better life outcomes in certain domains later on: academic performance, stress management, behavioral regulation. The findings were widely interpreted in an almost mythological way. A child waits for 2 marshmallows. A future is predicted. But this interpretation was too simplistic. Even Mischel himself later emphasized the nuance. This was never really a story about desserts. Nor was it proof that destiny can be diagnosed at 4 years old. The deeper lesson was behavioral. The experiment revealed something more universal and far less comforting. Success is often less about intensity of desire than management of discomfort. The child who waited was not necessarily less tempted. In many cases, they were simply better at surviving the internal discomfort created by delayed reward. That distinction changes everything, because most people imagine failure as wanting too little. Not ambitious enough, not hungry enough, not driven enough. But many forms of failure are not caused by weak desire. They are caused by an inability to tolerate the emotional cost between wanting and receiving. The boredom before mastery. The uncertainty before results. The repetition before competence. The invisible valley between action and reward. That valley is where people leak energy, identity, and commitment. Not because they do not care, but because they confuse discomfort with misalignment. And once that confusion becomes habitual, the mind begins building a dangerous equation. If this feels unpleasant, I should stop. This equation quietly shapes entire lives. A person starts learning a language, then stops when repetition becomes dull. Begins training, then withdraws when progress slows.
/escena. Escena. Texto.
The moment reward disappears, something unexpected is exposed. A person can tolerate discomfort when meaning is obvious. When there is a prize, a deadline, recognition, progress, or at least the promise of movement, the mind has something to grip. But remove all external stimulation, and a far stranger battle begins. In 2014, Psychologist Timothy Wilson and colleagues at the University of Virginia conducted a series of experiments with a deceptively simple design. Participants were asked to do almost nothing. No phone,
No conversation.
no books, no music.
No tasks.
They were instructed to sit alone in a room for a short period between 6 and 15 minutes and simply entertain themselves with their own thoughts. That was all. Not pain, not physical exertion, not emotional confrontation, just mental stillness. Before the experiment, many participants confidently predicted that this would not be difficult. After all, what could be easier than sitting quietly for a few minutes? But what followed revealed something deeply unsettling. A surprising number of participants reported that the experience was unpleasant. Not mildly dull, actively uncomfortable. People struggled to remain alone with unstructured thought. Attention drifted, agitation increased, and time began to stretch in psychologically distorted ways. The absence of stimulation did not create peace. It created friction. This is where the modern mind reveals one of its least flattering truths. It is not only addicted to pleasure, it is often unable to tolerate emptiness. Silence becomes abrasive. Stillness becomes tension. Nothing happening begins to feel like something is wrong. And when the brain cannot find stimulation externally, it starts searching aggressively for escape. Not because the room is threatening, but because internal understimulation itself begins to feel intolerable. One variation of the experiment introduced a device into the room. Participants were first allowed to experience a mild electric shock. They felt it. They knew it was unpleasant. In many cases, they even stated they would be willing to pay money to avoid experiencing it again. Then they were left alone. No entertainment.
No stimulation.
Just themselves, their thoughts, and access to the shock button. This is where the experiment crossed from interesting to disturbing. A significant number of participants voluntarily chose to shock themselves. Not once by accident. Intentionally. Men did this at particularly high rates, though women did as well. The logic is difficult to ignore. Human beings were placed in a room where the options were astonishingly simple. Sit quietly or experience mild pain. And many selected pain. This was not a failure of intelligence. Not a misunderstanding of instructions. Not confusion. It was something much more revealing. The mind was so resistant to unstructured internal experience that negative stimulation became preferable to insufficient stimulation. Pain was selected over boredom. Discomfort with clear sensation was chosen over discomfort without form. This changes how boredom must be understood. People often treat boredom as neutral, an empty inconvenience, a harmless pause between meaningful activity. But psychologically, boredom can function as a stressor. It generates restlessness, agitation, craving, and an urgent desire to alter one's state. Not because something meaningful is missing in the environment, but because the mind has become deeply dependent on occupation. Constant input, constant novelty, constant interruption. Remove these and many people do not encounter peace. They encounter withdrawal. This reveals something uncomfortable about the architecture of modern attention. The brain is adaptive. Expose it repeatedly to stimulation-rich environments, notifications, entertainment, scrolling, novelty loops, fragmented tasks, and baseline tolerance begins to shift. Ordinary reality starts losing intensity. Silence feels flatter. Routine feels heavier. Unstructured time becomes psychologically abrasive. Not because reality changed, because calibration changed. The nervous system quietly becomes accustomed to a level of stimulation that ordinary life cannot continuously provide. And once this happens, a dangerous reinterpretation emerges. Stillness feels like deficiency. Slowness feels like failure. Boredom feels like a signal to escape. This is where countless forms of self-sabotage begin. Person sits down to read. Within minutes, discomfort appears. Not dramatic suffering, just subtle friction, restlessness, the sensation that attention is starving. A tiny itch to move elsewhere, check something, open something, switch tasks, break state. The behavior seems trivial, but underneath it, a profound conditioning loop is operating. Discomfort appears. Escape follows. Relief arrives. Pattern reinforced. Repeat this enough times, and boredom itself becomes nearly intolerable. Not because it is objectively painful, but because the brain has been taught that low stimulation is a problem requiring immediate correction. This is why many people believe they have concentration issues, motivational deficits, or discipline failures. Sometimes the issue is more primitive. They have simply lost familiarity with mental stillness. And what is unfamiliar is often misread as threatening. The most revealing part of the experiment was never the electric shock. It was what the shock represented. Not a desire for pain, a rejection of emptiness, an inability to remain present when nothing externally comp.
/escena. Escena. Texto.
When external stimulation disappears, a person is forced into contact with something far less negotiable, themselves. And for some, that confrontation is not theoretical. It is physical, brutal, measured in sleep deprivation, freezing water, raw skin, and the systematic collapse of comfort. This was the environment David Goggins entered during Navy SEAL training, specifically the infamous Hell Week, a phase designed with ruthless precision to push candidates beyond what they believe they can endure. Hell Week is not subtle. Over more than 5 days, candidates are subjected to near-continuous physical exertion while surviving on minimal sleep, often totaling only a few hours across the entire period. They run through sand, carry boats over their heads, crawl through mud, enter freezing surf repeatedly, perform under constant fatigue while instructors apply relentless psychological pressure. This purpose is not merely to test strength. It is to expose the point at which identity begins to fracture. Throughout the process, one sound dominates the psychological landscape. The bell. A brass bell candidates can ring at any time to voluntarily quit. 3 rings. That is all it takes.
No debate. No justification. No explanation.
Just immediate relief. This is what makes the environment psychologically brilliant. The option to stop is always visible, always available, always seductive. Goggins has repeatedly described reaching states of total exhaustion where every internal signal was demanding surrender. Pain was everywhere. Fatigue became cognitive. Thought itself slowed. And still, the real battle was not muscular. It was interpretive. What does this sensation mean? Does this level of suffering indicate actual limit, or merely the mind's demand for escape? That distinction becomes life-altering, because once a person realizes the urge to quit can arrive long before actual incapacity, an uncomfortable possibility emerges. How many limits were never real to begin with? Most people believe quitting happens at the point of maximum pain. But environments like Hell Week reveal something less intuitive. The desire to quit often peaks before true physiological collapse. The mind generates urgency long before the body is fully depleted. This is one of Goggins' most repeated observations. He later popularized it as what became known as the 40% rule. The phrase is not a literal scientific measurement, nor was it introduced as one. It was Goggins' way of describing a psychological phenomenon he repeatedly experienced. When the mind convinces you that you are finished, you may have accessed only a fraction of your actual capacity. Not because pain is imaginary, not because exhaustion is fake, but because the brain is fundamentally predictive and protective. This job is not to maximize potential. This job is to reduce threat, conserve energy, avoid uncertainty, preserve survival margins. When stress accumulates, the brain begins generating increasingly persuasive reasons to stop. Not maliciously, strategically. This is what makes internal dialogue under pressure so convincing. You are done. This is enough. This is where identity begins to reorganize. Not when conditions are favorable. Not when confidence is high. Not when action feels aligned with desire. But after the internal command to stop has already appeared. This is the threshold Goggins repeatedly emphasizes. He did not describe transformation as becoming someone who never suffers. Quite the opposite. He built his philosophy around deliberate confrontation with suffering, voluntary exposure, controlled adversity, repeated contact with discomfort long enough to change interpretation. The body learns. But more importantly, the mind updates. A person survives a condition they previously believed intolerable. Then something subtle happens. The next challenge arrives carrying less authority. Not because it became easier, because its psychological meaning changed. This is why sustained discomfort can become identity-altering. Every time a person remains engaged beyond their predicted limit, they collect contradictory evidence against an old self-concept. I thought I would break here. I did not. I thought this would end me. It did not. The nervous system begins recalibrating what it considers survivable. What once triggered alarm now registers as manageable. This is not comfort. It is expanded capacity. The threshold moves. Not once. Repeatedly. And this movement is often invisible from the outside.
No applause.
No dramatic transformation sequence. Just a quiet redefinition of what the mind is allowed to call impossible. This is why discomfort tolerance is not merely behavioral. It is existential. Because every time you remain slightly longer than your old identity expects, you are not simply enduring. You are renegotiating who gets to define your limits. There is a point at which repeated failure stops feeling like an event and starts becoming an identity. Not because reality has changed, but because expectation has. In 1967, psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer conducted a series of experiments that would become foundational in behavioral psychology. Their research was not originally designed to explain human motivation, but what it uncovered reached far beyond the laboratory. Dogs were placed into controlled environments involving mild electric shocks. In one condition, the animals could stop the shock through an action. There was contingency, cause and effect. Behavior mattered. In another condition, the dogs were exposed to shocks they could not control or escape. No matter what they did, the discomfort continued. Movement changed nothing. Resistance changed nothing. Action produced no meaningful outcome. This distinction seems technical. It was not. Over time, something far more important than temporary distress began to emerge. The issue was no longer the shock itself. It was what the experience taught. When an organism repeatedly encounters discomfort that appears uncontrollable, a dangerous lesson begins consolidating beneath awareness. Nothing I do matters. This lesson is psychologically corrosive. Not because it creates immediate collapse, but because it alters future behavior before future events even occur. The body is still physically capable of action. The environment may eventually change. Escape may become possible. And yet behavior has already been rewritten. This is what makes helplessness so deceptive. It does not require actual incapacity, only learned expectation of futility. A nervous system exposed to repeated, uncontrollable discomfort begins conserving effort. Not out of laziness, out of adaptation. Why spend energy on action that history has taught is useless? The most disturbing part of the experiment came later. After repeated exposure to unavoidable shocks, the dogs were transferred into a new apparatus. This time, the conditions had changed. Escape was available. A low barrier separated the animal from safety. To avoid the shock, the dog simply had to jump over it. Physically, this was entirely possible. No extraordinary strength required. No complicated learning sequence. Just one action, one movement, one opportunity. And yet many of the previously conditioned dogs did not even attempt escape. They did not jump. They did not search. They did not test alternatives. Instead, they often lay down passively and endured the discomfort. This is what made the findings so psychologically unsettling. The barrier was not the true obstacle. The environment no longer held them in place. Expectation did. The dogs behaved as though escape were still impossible, even when reality had changed. This is the architecture of learned helplessness. Past uncontrollability contaminates future perception. A person or organism does not merely remember discomfort. They internalize a rule. Trying is pointless. And once that rule is installed deeply enough, effort begins disappearing before conscious thought even forms. This is why helplessness can look deceptively calm from the outside.
No visible panique. No dramatic breakdown.
Just passivity, stillness, behavioral surrender, an organism that has stopped testing the environment. Not because options do not exist, because experience has trained the mind to stop searching for them. This mechanism extends far beyond laboratory conditions. A person fails repeatedly in business, relationships, health, or self-discipline. They try. Nothing changes. They try again. Progress is inconsistent or invisible. Pain continues. Eventually, something subtle begins to shift. The external struggle becomes internal expectation. Failure is no longer experienced as an event. It becomes predictive. The mind begins running simulations before action is even attempted. Why bother? This never works. Nothing changes anyway. At this stage, avoidance stops looking emotional. It starts looking rational. Not pursuing the opportunity feels intelligent. Not risking disappointment feels efficient. Not trying feels like self-protection. This is what makes learned helplessness so dangerous. It often disguises itself as realism. But realism is not always accurate. Sometimes it is a narrative constructed from overgeneralized history. A few failed attempts become a worldview. Temporary conditions become permanent identity. One difficult season becomes an operating system. The person may still have options. Resources may exist. Conditions may be materially different than before. But psychologically, the environment has already been classified. Unsafe, pointless, unwinnable. And once a mind adopts these labels, behavior begins conforming around them. Not because the future is predetermined, because agency has been behaviorally suppressed. The most painful prison is often not built from actual barriers. It is built from conclusions. This is why rebuilding agency cannot begin with emotion alone. A person trapped in helplessness often waits to feel hopeful before acting, to feel motivated, confident, certain. But these states are often inaccessible precisely because passivity has already been reinforced. The system will not think its way out first. It must behave its way out. Action before certainty. Movement before belief. One small confrontation with discomfort that contradicts the old narrative. An attempt. A repetition. A decision to test reality again. Not because success is guaranteed. Because the learned rule must be challenged. This is how agency is rebuilt. Not in theory. In contact. Person X. The world responds. A new piece of data enters the system. Maybe effort is not always futile. Maybe the barrier is not as absolute as expected. Maybe the conclusion was outdated. This process is rarely dramatic. It is often almost embarrassingly small. But psychologically, it is revolutionary. Because helplessness is not broken by inspiration. It is broken by evidence. Evidence.
/escena. Escena. Texto.
Most people imagine change as a dramatic event. A new identity beginning with a decisive morning. A radical routine. Fogg's tiny habits method became known for its almost absurd simplicity. Instead of prescribing large routines, participants were encouraged to anchor microscopic behaviors to existing routines. After brushing your teeth, do 2 push-ups. After sitting at your desk, open the document. After pouring coffee, take 1 deep breath. The behavior had to be so small it could survive nearly any emotional condition. This is what makes the idea psychologically sophisticated. The objective is not performance. It is continuity. A tiny action may seem behaviorally insignificant, but significance is not measured only by output. It is also measured by identity reinforcement. A person who consistently performs one small behavior is not merely doing the action. They are collecting evidence. I am someone who continues. This matters more than most people realize. Motivation is volatile. Identity is accumulative. Every repeated action quietly votes for a self-concept. This is why missing one enormous habit can feel catastrophic. It reinforces a narrative of inconsistency. But completing an extremely small action preserves something more valuable than intensity. Preserves the chain. Behavior remains alive. This is crucial under discomfort, because emotional resistance does not negotiate with ideals. It negotiates with thresholds. Can you continue under friction? Can you maintain behavioral contact when enthusiasm disappears? Tiny habits reduce the activation energy required to answer yes. Not by removing discomfort entirely, by shrinking the action below the threshold where resistance can easily veto it. A single rep, one sentence, one page, 1 minute, insignificant in isolation, psychologically strategic in repetition. This principle extends beyond habit formation into something more fundamental: discomfort training. A person does not become more resilient only through large ordeals. Often, resilience is constructed through repeated micro-exposures to manageable friction. Finish the task even when interest disappears. Read one more page after attention begins fading. Stay seated for 1 extra minute after the urge to leave appears. Continue slightly beyond the first internal negotiation. These acts look trivial. They are not. Each one teaches the nervous system a different rule. Discomfort is not automatically terminal. Resistance does not require immediate retreat. An unpleasant state can be entered, tolerated, and exited without collapse. This is a profound recalibration, because many people unconsciously build their behavior around minimizing discomfort exposure. They stop when friction appears, rest when boredom emerges, switch tasks when mental resistance rises. This creates a fragile operating system. The brain learns an implicit equation. If discomfort appears, disengage. Micro-exposures interrupt this equation. They introduce alternative evidence. Discomfort appears. Action continues. Nothing catastrophic happens. The loop changes. This is why small acts repeated under friction can become disproportionately powerful. Not because the action itself is difficult, because the pattern being installed is different. Stay, remain, continue, just slightly longer. Over time, this changes what the mind interprets as tolerable. Thresholds expand quietly. The person who once abandoned effort at the first sign of discomfort now remains a little longer. Then a little longer again. Transformation begins here, not in intensity, but in repetition under resistance. This is what makes tiny behaviors deceptively powerful. They are small enough to seem unimportant, which is precisely why the ego often dismisses them. Too easy, too minor, too insignificant to matter. But behavior does not care about drama, cares about repetition. A single minute repeated daily can outperform an hour attempted sporadically and abandoned.
/escena. Escena. Texto.
Discomfort is often treated as a fixed signal. Cold means danger. Pain means retreat. Stress means something is wrong. The body reacts. The mind obeys. And for most people, this sequence feels automatic, almost mechanical. Stimulus appears. Resistance follows. Avoidance begins. But what if this chain is more flexible than it appears? What if repeated contact with discomfort can alter not only subjective tolerance but measurable physiology? This possibility became the focus of scientific attention through the case of Wim Hof. Known publicly for his extreme cold exposure practices, Hof became famous for feats that seemed biologically implausible. Prolonged immersion in ice, climbing snowy mountains with minimal clothing, enduring cold environments that would provoke intense stress responses in most people. To many observers, this looked like anomaly, a rare individual, an outlier.
À biological exception.
But that assumption became scientifically interesting, because if these responses were trainable rather than innate, the implications were far more unsettling. Researchers at Radboud University in the Netherlands decided to investigate. Their interest was not mythology. It was mechanism. Could deliberate practices involving breathing techniques, focused attention, and repeated cold exposure alter systems typically considered largely automatic? Systems like autonomic nervous function and immune response. These are domains most people treat as inaccessible. Heartbeat, inflammation, stress reactions, physiological regulation, processes assumed to happen to you, not through you. And yet this assumption was precisely what the researchers began testing. Not whether cold was pleasant, not whether discomfort disappeared, but whether voluntary repeated exposure could fundamentally change the body's relationship to stress. A deeper question was emerging underneath the ice. How much of what you call automatic is simply untrained? In 2014, researchers published findings that pushed this question into serious scientific territory. Participants were trained in methods associated with Wim Hof, including specific breathing exercises, meditation-like focus, and gradual cold exposure. After training, these individuals underwent an experimental procedure involving endotoxin administration. A bacterial component was injected to provoke an immune response. Under normal conditions, this reliably produces symptoms: fever, chills, headache, inflammatory reaction, a measurable activation of the immune system. The body responds predictably. At least that is what was expected. But trained participants demonstrated something unusual. Compared with control groups, they showed increased epinephrine levels and reduced inflammatory responses. Symptoms were significantly attenuated. Their bodies were not ignoring the challenge. They were modulating their response to it. This was the critical distinction. The external stressor had not changed. The endotoxin remained the same. The cold remained cold. The challenge remained physiologically real. What changed was the system interpreting and regulating the response. This is what made the findings so compelling. Not because participants became superhuman, but because processes assumed to be largely involuntary showed evidence of partial trainability. Repeated exposure combined with deliberate regulation had altered biological response patterns. This reframes discomfort in a profound way. Most people experience stress as something that simply happens to them. An event arrives. The body reacts. End of story. But these findings suggest a more dynamic reality. Response is not always fixed. With training, the organism itself can change how it meets the same stimulus. Not by removing discomfort, by changing the relationship to it. This principle reaches far beyond cold exposure. Cold is merely a visible form of stress. Clean, immediate, unambiguous. The body protests instantly. Breathing tightens. Skin contracts. The nervous system signals urgency. Get out. Escape. Restore comfort. This makes cold an unusually honest teacher. It strips away abstraction. Discomfort becomes undeniable. And this is precisely why repeated voluntary exposure is powerful. A person enters controlled stress repeatedly, not recklessly, deliberately. The nervous system encounters discomfort. Initially, alarm is intense. Resistance is immediate. But over repeated
/escena. Escena. Texto.
There is a seductive lie hidden inside the idea of practice. That improvement is mostly a matter of repetition. More hours, more exposure, more time spent doing the thing. At first glance, this sounds logical. Practice more, improve more. But this explanation collapses under scrutiny. People repeat the same behaviors for years and remain functionally unchanged. Musicians plateau. Athletes stagnate. Professionals repeat routines without measurable growth. Time alone is clearly insufficient. Something else determines whether repetition produces adaptation or merely reinforces existing limits. This became central to the work of psychologist Anders Ericsson, whose research on expert performance fundamentally challenged popular assumptions about talent, mastery, and progress. Beginning in the early 1990s, Ericsson and colleagues studied high-level performers across multiple domains: music, chess, athletics, medicine, and other cognitively demanding fields. Their interest was not simply who performed well. It was how experts actually trained. And what they found was psychologically inconvenient. Elite performers did not merely accumulate more practice. They accumulated a different kind of practice. Not enjoyable repetition. Not comfortable performance. Not endless execution of already mastered skills. Their training disproportionately targeted areas of weakness, specific errors, precise deficiencies, narrow zones where performance repeatedly broke down. This kind of work was effortful, mentally exhausting, and often deeply frustrating. In other words, elite improvement was not built primarily inside confidence. It was built inside strain. This matters because most people unconsciously confuse activity with development. They repeat what feels productive, what feels familiar, what protects self-image. But development often requires entering regions where competence temporarily disappears, where friction rises, where mistakes become visible, where progress feels least obvious. The very places most people instinctively avoid are often the exact locations where growth is hiding. Erickson described this as deliberate practice, a term often repeated, rarely understood. Deliberate practice is not merely disciplined repetition. It is structured exposure to difficulty at the edge of current ability. A performer intentionally engages tasks they cannot yet do reliably. This is what makes the process cognitively expensive. Attention must remain high. Feedback must remain active. Errors must be noticed, analyzed, and corrected. This is exhausting, not physically necessarily, mentally, emotionally. Sustained contact with inadequacy is rarely pleasant. A violinist isolates a difficult passage and repeats it slowly, making microscopic corrections. A chess player studies failed positions and reconstructs decision errors. A surgeon practices narrow technical sequences where precision repeatedly fails. The work is not glamorous. It is often monotonous and psychologically abrasive. There is little reward density, few obvious wins.
No immediate mastery.
Only repeated confrontation with what is currently insufficient. This is where many people disengage. Not because they are incapable of improvement, because the emotional texture of deliberate practice feels wrong. It feels like incompetence, like regression, like evidence of deficiency. But this interpretation is misleading. In many cases, frustration is not evidence of poor progress. It is evidence of direct contact with a growth boundary. The system is being challenged precisely where adaptation is required. This reframes an experience most people misclassify. Difficulty is not always a warning sign. Sometimes it is a location marker. You have arrived at the edge of your current capacity. Stay here long enough and the edge begins to move. This is why progress often feels most invisible precisely when it is most active. Popular imagination expects growth to feel encouraging. Smooth upward movement, visible improvement, positive reinforcement. But adaptation is often much less emotionally cooperative. Performance temporarily destabilizes. Error frequency increases. Attention fatigue rises.
Frustration peaks.
This can feel like deterioration. It is often recalibration. An old automated pattern is being interrupted. A more precise one has not yet stabilized. The person is caught between versions, no longer fully able to rely on previous competence, not yet capable of effortless execution at the new level. This middle territory is psychologically brutal. You are working harder while feeling worse, expending more effort while receiving less emotional reward. This is where most people retreat. They interpret
_escena. Escena. Texto.
At a certain level of challenge, differences in intelligence begin to matter less than people assume. Talent narrows. Preparation converges. Selection becomes increasingly competitive. And yet, even in environments where nearly everyone is capable, outcomes still diverge dramatically. Some remain, others leave. Not because they suddenly became less intelligent. Not because they lost all physical capacity. Something else determines who persists once difficulty becomes chronic. This question became central to psychologist Angela Duckworth. Her work focused on a trait she called grit, sustained passion and perseverance directed toward long-term goals. Duckworth and colleagues investigated whether grit could predict persistence under these conditions. Incoming cadets completed assessments designed to measure perseverance and consistency of long-term commitment. The results were revealing. Grit predicted who was more likely to remain through beast barracks beyond several traditional measures. Not perfectly. Human behavior rarely yields perfect predictors. But meaningfully, this was significant, because it suggested endurance in high-friction environments depends on more than intelligence, standardized scores, or visible talent. The capacity to remain engaged when progress is unpleasant may be independently decisive. This is psychologically important. Most people admire persistence abstractly, but few understand what it feels like operationally. Persistence is rarely cinematic. It is usually repetitive contact with unremarkable discomfort. Wake up tired. Continue. Feel uncertain. Continue. Lose enthusiasm. Continue. Encounter boredom. Continue. This is far less glamorous than popular narratives of resilience suggest. There is often no heroic emotional state, no internal soundtrack, no certainty that the effort is worth it. Only decision layered on top of decision. A sequence of continued engagement after the emotional system has repeatedly offered exit routes. This is what grit often looks like in reality. Not dramatic sacrifice. Behavioral stubbornness in ordinary moments. Remaining after the mind has begun offering rationalizations for withdrawal. This is why persistence can appear externally invisible while being internally expensive. The person is not battling the environment alone. They are repeatedly negotiating with themselves. One practical principle associated with long-term endurance is deceptively simple. Stay slightly longer than comfort recommends. Not indefinitely, not recklessly, just beyond the first internal demand to stop. This idea resembles what is sometimes operationalized as a 10-minute rule. When the urge to quit appears, continue a little longer. 10 more minutes, 10 more repetitions, 10 more pages, 10 more breaths. The number itself is less important than the behavioral principle. Delay obedience. Insert distance between discomfort and disengagement. This matters because the initial impulse to stop is often not an accurate measure of actual limit. It is an early negotiation signal. Proposal. Not a verdict. The mind says enough. You remain briefly anyway. Something subtle happens. You survive the interval. The predicted collapse often does not occur. Capacity updates. This repeated experience compounds. A person learns that urges are transient. Fatigue fluctuates. Motivation is unstable. But behavior can continue without emotional consensus. This is psychologically transformative, because identity is shaped less by isolated grand acts and more by repeated small negotiations. Who do you become when discomfort arrives? What rule governs your response? Leave immediately or remain slightly longer? This is where character is often built so gradually it becomes almost invisible. 1,000 minor decisions no audience will ever witness. But each one leaves residue, a behavioral vote, a reinforcement of what kind of person you are.
/escena. Escena. Texto.
Most people spend their lives negotiating with discomfort as if it were an enemy. A sensation arrives. Tension in the chest. Mental fatigue. Restlessness. Doubt. The body interprets these signals as problems to solve immediately. Relief becomes the objective. Not truth. Not growth. Not alignment. Only reduction of internal friction. This is how subtle forms of self-abandonment become normalized. You leave the task because resistance appeared. You postpone the conversation because anxiety surfaced. You abandon the effort because enthusiasm declined. And each decision feels rational in isolation. Small, harmless, even compassionate. But beneath these choices, something more structural is being reinforced. A rule. When discomfort appears, retreat. This rule does not remain confined to trivial moments. It scales into work, relationships, ambition, identity. Eventually, the person is no longer merely avoiding isolated, unpleasant experiences. They are organizing an entire life around the minimization of psychological friction. A strangely modern form of captivity. Not chains, preferences, an invisible architecture built around the pursuit of immediate emotional regulation. This creates a hidden paradox. The more aggressively a person protects themselves from discomfort, the smaller their life often becomes. Options narrow. Tolerance contracts. Fragility increases. The world begins feeling increasingly hostile, not because reality changed, but because the threshold for internal disturbance became too low. The prison is subtle. It often feels like self-care. But if every difficult sensation becomes a reason to exit, what remains is not freedom. Only increasingly sophisticated avoidance. Discomfort has no inherent meaning. This is one of the most difficult truths to accept. The sensation itself is neutral. Raw data, pressure, heat, restlessness, urge. The story comes later. The mind assigns interpretation with astonishing speed. This is dangerous, because interpretation is often inherited rather than examined. Discomfort means danger. Difficulty means stop. Uncertainty means wrong path. Fatigue means limit. These assumptions quietly govern behavior long before conscious reasoning enters the room. But sensations are not instructions. They are information, and information can be misread. A racing heart can signal panic, or readiness. Silence can signal emptiness, or space. Effort can signal misalignment, or meaningful strain. The nervous system is not a philosopher. It detects change and deviation. It amplifies novelty, prefers predictability. This is adaptive, but not always accurate. A person who never questions the interpretation layer becomes obedient to signals they do not fully understand. They confuse detection with truth. This is why psychological maturity requires a strange skill. Feeling without immediate agreement. Allowing sensation to exist without instantly constructing a command around it. Pain may still matter. Fear may still be useful. Exhaustion may still require rest. But none of these states deserve automatic authority. Not every alarm is prophecy. Not every internal signal deserves obedience. Sometimes the mind is merely reacting to expansion as if it were threat. And if you cannot tell the difference, your own nervous system can quietly become your most persuasive jailer. Identity is often misunderstood as something discovered, a hidden essence waiting to be revealed, a stable truth buried beneath conditioning. But much of identity is not found. It is accumulated, built through repetition so mundane it rarely feels significant while it is happening. A person becomes what they repeatedly reinforce, not what they occasionally admire, not what they intellectually endorse. Behavior leaves residue. Every exit strengthens one pathway. Every stay strengthens another. This process is indifferent to your intentions. You may deeply value courage while rehearsing avoidance daily. You may admire discipline while reinforcing impulsivity hourly. The nervous system does not update according to aspiration. It updates according to repetition. This is why small decisions are rarely small. They are votes, not toward outcomes alone but toward architecture. A behavioral blueprint under constant revision. You are teaching yourself who you are through action faster than through thought. This is both threatening and liberating. Threatening because no fantasy protects you from repetition. Liberating because no past identity is fully immune to it either. Change does not require emotional readiness. Only enough behavioral consistency to outvote an old pattern. Not once. Not dramatically. Repeatedly. Long enough for the unfamiliar to stop feeling foreign. Long enough for resistance to lose narrative dominance. Long enough for a different version of self to begin feeling less like effort and more like fact.